Hi, I'm Pam Arciero, and you're watching a podcast where nostalgia comes alive. It's Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show. Roll it!
Welcome to Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, where nostalgia comes alive. Join Jake and his friends on a journey through pop culture of the past, where they interview professionals in the worlds of acting, directing, writing, puppeteering, and so much more. Who will they be chatting with today? Find out in this Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show episode.
Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, where nostalgia comes alive. Happy here with us. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm your host, Jake Davenbaugh. With me today, as always, our co-hosts, Chris Bixby and Matt Bingle. Hey guys.
Doing good.
Doing good. Hello everybody. How are you, Jake?
Doing great, Matt. Thank you for asking.
Yes, we had a wonderful interview today, and you folks will love it. Today's guest is John Weidman. He's a television writer and librettist, which means he has written books for theater. He wrote for Sesame Street for several decades. We'll be talking about that, the Elmo Visits the Firehouse episode that he wrote, a whole bunch of other things, as well as a lot of his theater work with musicals like Pacific Overtures, Assassins, just a whole bunch of wonderful conversations and topics are shared in this interview. Enjoy.
See you then. Hello everyone, welcome to Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show, the podcast where nostalgia comes alive.
Yes, today we are pleased to welcome John Weidman. John, happy to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. I'm enjoying it so far. See how it goes.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
So to start this off,
Absolutely.
could you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
A little bit about myself and what I do. Well, I've been a writer of one kind or another for my entire career, for my entire life. My career, with a pen in my hand, started late. I graduated from college in 1968. I wound up in law school in the early 70s because that seemed like a place to go if you didn't exactly know what you wanted to do with the rest of your life. I had no ambitions to be a writer at the time. I liked law school. I was at Yale with a really interesting group of people. And but I had the obligatory summer job as an attorney. And I thought, I'm not doing this. This is a very bad fit. I'm not going to enjoy this and I'm not going to be particularly good at it. So I went back to law school and I kind of did what people did in those days, which was to just make up something I could do that might turn into something I might do after that. I was an undergraduate at Harvard and I'd been on the Harvard Lampoon. So I was already at the time, even while I was in law school, I was contributing to National Lampoon magazine and I'd really been doing that since the first issue. So I had started kind of down that path, but more as a hobby than anything else. But when I was in law school, I didn't want to quit because I liked it. And I decided that what I would do is in my spare time at law school, I would write a play. And I did. And I had majored in East Asian studies at Harvard. And so trying to decide what I would write about, I hit on the idea of writing a play about Commodore Perry's expedition to open up Japan. And so I wrote it as a straight play. I called it Pacific Overtures. I managed to get it to Hal Prince, who decided that he would produce it as a straight play. And during the process of casting it and thinking about it, he changed his mind and decided that it would be a musical. And so I got in touch with Steve Sondheim and kind of bullied Steve into agreeing to do it. Hal was nothing if not persuasive. And so I came out of law school with, a first show, which suddenly I was working on that was heading for Broadway, and with a career I could pick up again at National Lampoon. And I was sort of off to the races. And I see Elmo over your shoulder. I added Sesame Street very happily a number of years later. When Animal House came out, almost everybody who was connected to the Lampoon suddenly became of interest to producers in Hollywood, hoping that lightning could strike twice. So I got hired to write 3 or 4 films that were, especially the last 2 were quite good, but they never got made. And I thought, well, the John Weidman Film Festival is going to play on a shelf in my in my office someplace. And I came home, I flew home from LA. I came out of the house. My daughter, who was like 3 years old at the time, was sitting on the couch watching Sesame Street, which a show I had never seen before because it didn't exist when I was Sesame Street age. And there was no particular reason to watch it until I had a kid. So I sat down with Laura and I watched it and I thought, this really seems like kind of smart, worthy work. So instead of banging my head against the wall trying to get a movie made, why don't I see if I can step into this space as a space that would complement the work that I was still doing in the musical theater? And it worked out. I went through the audition process. I got the characters. I mean, I got the show. The show kind of got me. I mean, over 20 very satisfying years writing for Sesame Street while I was also writing, for the musical theater, doing a half dozen different shows, 3 with Steve Sondheim, a couple with Susan Stroman. It was an unusual, but it was a very satisfying complementary mix.
Nice, absolutely.
I've now told you everything you want to know about my career, so we can wrap it up.
Love that. So now I'm kind of curious. What was your childhood like, and how did you grow up?
What was my childhood like? Okay, I just got off with my therapist. If I'd known you were going to ask me that, I could have asked him to hang around. He could have helped answer the question. I grew up. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1946, and my parents were sort of lifelong New Yorkers. My dad was, but what people kind of did after the war was move out of New York. And my dad, my mom, and my brother, who was a little older than me, moved to Westport, Connecticut. So I kind of grew up in Southern Connecticut. My dad was a novelist. He wrote novels and short stories, and quite successful and quite celebrated. Jerome Weidman was his name. And, most of his stories were published in the New Yorker and other prestigious places like that. He wrote a lot of novels that were big bestsellers. And so, the other kids at school had parents who got up and went to work. And my dad did too, but it consisted of getting up and going into the study and sitting down in front of a yellow legal pad and writing. I didn't really have any appreciation for what he did or think about it much. I was playing Little League and doing what you do as a kind of a regular kid in a regular place, which Westport was at the time. And, occasionally my parents would bring me into the city with my brother to see a musical or to go to the Museum of Natural History. It was a fairly, it was not unusual middle class-ish. Westport wasn't really a suburb, a kind of suburban upbringing in Connecticut. And as I said, I had no ambitions to be a writer. I had no ambitions to be much of anything except, to play shortstop or second base for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And then they moved to LA and I realized I wasn't really a very good baseball player. So I set that aside. And then I was just kind of putting one foot in front of the other. And as I said, until I kind of stumbled into what I was going to do for a living. My father's attitude towards my choice of a career was basically alarm. I mean, he felt that being a writer was an unbelievably unstable and risky proposition, and that his ambition for me was I would pretty much anything else. And part of going to law school was like taking a step in the direction of anything else, but. Like I said, I've had a very ordinary life in Southern Connecticut. Then the family moved back into New York City when I was about 12 or 13. And I started to take myself to the theater or go to the theater on dates all the time. So I became like a major theater audience member, but not with any expectation that I was going to make a career there. And so, that was me.
Nice. And that's actually a perfect segue. What was kind of like your first exposure to theater, if you can remember?
Yeah, my parents claim that they took me to see South Pacific when I, so small I had to sit on coats. I don't remember that. I do remember, like virtually every kid my age, being taken into New York to see Mary Martin and Peter Pan.
Oh,
which
nice.
I do remember vividly. And I have a fairly distinct memory of a couple of other shows that I was taken to see. One, The Music Man, which was, something else. And also the musical version of Lil Abner, which is actually a very good show. It's been done at Encores since then. Yeah, it was it was like a field trip to New York, and going to a show was part of it. Also involved, eating in a restaurant, which was an exciting adventure. It was like that. It was but as I said, it was not anything which was nudging me towards having any kind of a career in the theater. I was not in the drama club at my high school. The last time I was in a play was in an 8th grade production of Henry V, and I
Oh
was
wow.
terrible. Even I knew I was terrible. It's like my parents, nobody could think of anything that, and people were kind to me afterwards, but even while it was happening, I thought, I'm really not good at this. And so it was like, yeah, but that that was fine. I didn't care. As long as I didn't have to do it again and make a fool of myself twice. So as I said, I mean, but I should say this. I mean, I went to the theater all the time because the experience of being in a theater in front of something that was really stimulating and compelling was always exciting to me. And I have very vivid memory. Maybe it was the first time I went by myself after we moved to New York, but sitting in the mezzanine and watching a guy who at the time was a celebrated English actor named Morris Evans, playing Captain Shotover in a production of Heartbreak House, and so it's like my 13-year-old kid, and I'm really enjoying George Bernard Shaw. So it's like I just like being in the theater. When the lights went down, I was like, ooh, what's going to happen next?
Nice.
Usually, one way or another, I would find something that was satisfying about what I had gone to see.
Nice.
Awesome.
Interesting. So you mentioned in your introduction you worked with Sondheim with several musicals. How did
Yeah.
you first discover Stephen's work?
Well, I mean, I had been a fan of, before I went to work with him, I had seen his earlier works, all of my guests. I'd seen Gypsy, for which he wrote the lyrics, not the music. But I was taken to see Gypsy after we moved to New York. I think it was the 1959-60 season. And I remember sitting on the aisle when there was this noise coming down the aisle next to me, and it was Ethel Merman making her entrance. But then, I went to see all all the shows that Steve did with Hal Prince, the ones that preceded the Pacific Overtures, Company, Follies, and Little Night Music. And I went to see all Hal Prince's shows too, which were, Cabaret was like a major experience for me in the theater. I mean, I'd never seen anything quite like it. And so I was going to see the best musicals being done by the most challenging musicals being done by the best people. And then suddenly I was collaborating with Steve as opposed to just being, a kid sitting in the back enjoying his work. It's a little intimidating, exhilarating, but intimidating too.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, the first musical you and Stephen have worked on was Pacific Overtures. So could you kind of describe what that musical was about?
Yeah, I had been fascinated in college, but as I said, I majored in East Asian studies, particularly modern Japanese history, which was an eccentric thing to do in the 60s. Even at Harvard had a very good department. But even so, I didn't arrive at Harvard thinking I was going to do that. I kind of stumbled into that too. So I came out of college with this body of knowledge, and I thought, well, maybe I'll go in the Foreign Service. I had an internship at the State Department when I was in college. I thought, nah, I'm not going to do that. But I was still carrying this body of knowledge with me. And when I thought I would sit down and write a play, I went back to that history, which I knew, which other people did not, because I thought, first of all, it had excited me when I was a student. And so I thought writing about it would also be exciting. And it was satisfying. But I thought I knew something that other people didn't know, and that would be a good place to start if I was going to write something. And, I wasn't quite sure how to approach the material, but I was able to kind of finagle my way into Hal Prince's with him about it. Hal was always very open to talking to new people, and he thought it was a good idea. And he said, but it needs to be written from the point of view of the Japanese, the people who are being invaded, as opposed to from the point of view of the Americans who are engaging in this overseas adventure, which was important, but not important the way it was to the Japanese, whose whole country was turned upside down by this casual extension of American power into the Pacific. And so, I went to work on that, and that's what we did. And Hal was interested from the very beginning, when we were just talking about it, in as a director, in creating a kind of an amalgamation of American musical theater techniques and kabuki theater techniques, which have the same kind of color and size, or they have a color and size which made them an interesting fit with American musical theater. And so that, it things sort of fell into place in a unexpected, to say the least, way. And the show is, the show is done regularly, not often, because it really needs to be. The intention was that it would be performed by an all Asian American cast, which it was on Broadway in 1976, and it really only works when it's cast that way. I saw there was a production in Tokyo, which I went to see a little over a year ago. Then that production moved to London, so it gets done. I see it on and off. It's always nice to revisit it. And John Doyle, a director I've worked with a lot, did it at Classic Stage Company, which is an off-Broadway house, about 5 or 6 years ago. And Steve and I went back to work on it and fiddled with it and changed it a little bit, which was satisfying. When you write a piece for the theater, it doesn't ever have to be finished until you're dead. And even then, other people may try and lay their hands on it, So it's that's 50, really, basically, it was written 50 years ago, but whenever there's a major production, it's the chance to think, do we really need that scene? Could it be shorter? Could it be different? But it was very satisfying. And it's got an amazing score. Sondheim score is something else.
Absolutely.
Yes, indeed. So after Pacific Overtures, you worked with Stephen again on the musicals Assassins and Roadshow. Do you kind of talk a bit about those?
Yeah, I was, I had done sometimes Steve and I liked each other. We became friends after we did Pacific Overtures. And I had, with a friend of mine, Tim Krause, written a new book for the musical Anything Goes. It was done at Lincoln Center Theater, 1980, I don't know, 7. And it was a big hit. What was a big hit in those days, meaning it ran for 2 years. And so I had this show running, and I thought this would be a smart time to really step back in a major way into the musical theater. And I had an idea for a show, and I called Steve and I went over and talked to him about it. And I want to write a musical about the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Basically, it's always seemed to be, not just to me, but to many people, to be the beginning of the end of the world, given the way what people's ambitions were post World War I and what they came out of the peace conference having achieved. So I described it to Steve. We talked about it a little bit. He said, "Yeah, I don't know." He said, "It feels more like a movie." He said, "What do you think about this, Assassins?" And I said, "Well, why don't you say some more?" And he described how he had been a judge, one of a number of judges, some musical theater competition, a few years prior to that. And one of the musicals that he had read and listened to, and written by a guy named Charlie Gilbert, who wrote a show about a guy who a Vietnam vet, gets involved in a kind of a shadowy conspiracy to kill the president, but decorating the script were occasional appearances by assassins from American history, of John Wilkes Booth, Leon Czolgosz, and he remained interested in those characters. And so we started to really just to talk about the characters. And we would meet every week and just to see where the raw material might take us. And at a certain point, I realized that I was in high school when Kennedy was killed, and it was like a big event in my life, the way it was for a lot of people my age.
Right. Yeah.
I went down to Washington and stood on the sidewalk for the funeral cortege and all that stuff. And I realized I'd never quite, I hadn't thought about it, but at some level, Kennedy's assassination didn't make sense to me, whatever I mean by that. And that working on this material was a chance to kind of try and process that event and see where did it come from? And some of these other events maybe come from a similar place. And so those conversations are what threw us forward into the show, which we wrote quite quickly. Steve's very slow, and me too, but not in that case. And we didn't involve anybody else in the process until we had actually finished writing it. And then it got produced at Playwright's Horizons, and people weren't ready for it. Let me put it that way. And it took a while for audiences to catch up with the show. There was a great production now, about 20 that Joe Mantello directed at the Roundabout with a great cast. And, that won a bunch of Tony Awards, and all of a sudden people who weren't fans of the show were. So it's sad, but it's had a really interesting history, and it gets done a lot now.
Absolutely. So aside from your work with Stephen, you also got to work with theater director and choreographer Susan Stroman. Can you talk a bit about your work with her?
Yeah, she and I were buddies, and I had written the book for, and she had been the choreographer on a musical that didn't really work. It was fine, but of limited interest, which was a musical based on the movie Big, which I guess we had done in the mid-90s. And I ran for a while on Broadway, and there have been some good productions since then. But the main thing is that she and I, we just liked each other. We really liked working together. And one day, I guess about 25 years ago, the late 90s, I would say, Stroh called me up, and she said she had just gotten a call from Andre Bishop, who was the artistic director and still is at Lincoln Center. And that Andre had called her up and said, look, he really liked her work on Broadway. She'd done commercial work, she was really good at it. And he said, if you had an idea for something you wanted to work on, I'd be happy to turn over one of my rehearsal rooms to you and, give you a bit of a budget. And a show doesn't have to come out of it, but I'd love to see, what you came up with, kind of being your own director, not just choreographer, kind of working on your own. And so she liked that idea, obviously. And as soon as she was done with Andre, she called me up and described this phone call. And she said, do you want to come over and talk about what we might do together? And I said, yeah. So, not unlike Assassins, I went over to Stroh's apartment. We sat around her living room to see what we could invent as an idea for a show. And sorry guys, phone's ringing. She had, not that long before we had this conversation, she had been to some after hours club downtown where there was a woman, there was a pool hall. At the end, at night, they would push the pool tables aside, no small thing, and people would dance. And she said there was this woman she saw in a yellow dress who was very standoffish, and she was gorgeous, and she would dance with one guy for one dance and then retreat. She was not trying to hook up with anybody. It was not clear what she wanted to do other than kind of be there and then go home. And Stroh was really interested in her and interested in what might happen to a guy who walked into the club, saw her, and had some kind of experience with her. And so we took that as a starting point and developed a really interesting elaboration on that idea. Who's the guy? What's he doing there? What happens to him while he's there? How does she change his life? And so we went into the rehearsal room. I mean, by the time we were through talking, Stroh we'd figured out what the score was, the things that she wanted to dance to. And I had written a script, which looks more like a movie script because the primary vocabulary of the piece was going to be dance. There's a significant amount of dialogue when it was needed. And so we went into the rehearsal room and we built the show on a group of dancers. And as I said, there was no expectation that it was actually going to be produced. But Andre and Bernie Gersten, who was his partner, came down to see it and said, yeah, we should do this. And so Stro and I then figured out two other pieces that were like curtain raisers. And, it opened at the Bitsy Newhouse. The New York Times loved it. It moved upstairs to the Vivian Beaumont, ran there for 2 or 3 years, I guess. And it was very satisfying. It was really, really good piece. Totally unlike anything I had done before or anything I've done since then. But again, I've been very lucky in my collaborators. It start with Stephen Sondheim. That's all the luck anybody needs. But working with Stro has been great. We did another show at Lincoln Center after that. And we're frequently in conversation about something we might next do. She's a busy, busy person. She works all the time.
Nice.
That's wonderful. So, now you also wrote for the National Lampoon magazine. Now, what was kind of that experience like for you?
Well, it was, there were two guys, one guy in my class at Harvard, one guy who was a year ahead of him, Doug Kenny and Henry Beard. And they came to New York after graduating and started this magazine. The Harvard Lampoon had done, for a number of years, every year had done an issue which was a parody of some magazine, some other magazine, and it would be distributed nationally. They did a parody of, I think of Mademoiselle, like a couple of others, I can't remember. And there was a guy who had a company in New York who'd handle the distribution, and he was up for trying to start a national humor magazine. And so that's where National Lampoon came from. And, I will say that it was launched, I can't remember exactly what the year was, but it was 5 years. It was like the hippest place to write comedy in New York. It's like a lot of guys who moved over to Saturday Night started there. Michael O'Donoghue, a lot of the performing team, Belushi and Bill Murray were all connected to the Lampoon and did sort of live Lampoon projects. It was a very hip place to work. And it's like you got, which at the times I didn't reflect on that much, but it's like we were quite well paid for misbehaving. It's like we were kind of fucking off and everybody would only turn their work in at the very last minute. But the magazine was good. I don't go back and look at it much because I prefer to live with the idea that it was good than have that undermined by taking a look at some of the stuff between the covers. But it was a great place to work. And again, that was compatible with stuff I was doing in the musical theater because they were such different lanes.
Absolutely. So now moving on to Sesame Street. I know you kind of touched a little bit on it earlier, but what was the process like of actually getting to write for the show for the first time?
Well, I had a friend, a guy named Tony Geis, who wrote for the New York.
Oh, rest his soul.
Yeah.
Oh, Tony, yeah. I mean, and I knew Tony wrote for Sesame Street. So I called him up and I said, how does this work? If I wanted to, he said, there's an audition process. He said, they're not going to just hire anybody. He said, so, you kind of put your name in and if they want to kind of move forward, they'll give you assignments to write bits, and then the head writer Norman Stiles will review the bits.
Oh, I love Norman.
Norman, yeah, he's great.
Yeah, Norman was the head writer when I started there, and then if that's kind of working out, they may ask you to write a script. And so it was all about kind of one foot in front of the other, and I hit it off with Norman, I think, from the beginning. And, Norman said to me, Norman never said this in so many words, but it was like, some people just get the show or they don't get the show. And if you don't get the show, you're not going to get the show. It's like the sensibility of the show just kind of lined up with part of my brain. And it's like, I remember Norman saying to me at one point, he said, yeah, you're hearing the characters. You're hearing the characters, and it's like, and I thought, I feel like it's like I can write for Grover, and I can write for, Elmo was a kind of a peripheral character at the time, And so I went through that process, and then really very quickly there was no. I mean, you had to make a commitment at the beginning of the season as to how many scripts you were going to write. But if I was really busy with a theater piece, then I could say I can only do two, or what was enough to satisfy my health insurance obligation at the Writers Guild. But there was a lot of flexibility, and the group of writers were just a pleasure to be around. I mean, they were in their own ways, they were all the same kind of weird, twisted comedy writers who were writing comedy in other places, but they had a sunnier attitude towards life because they were doing it for preschool kids. But it was a great opportunity to, as I said, to use a different muscle. And to, back to Tony, I mean, Judy Freudberg, Tony Geis, I mean, all the people I was writing with, were really wonderful. And I have to say, going into this first time I went into the studio, and Frank Oz and Jim Henson turned up to do one of my bits. It's like watching those guys work, and working with those guys was like doing a play at the National with John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson. And there was nobody in the world who could do what these guys did with these puppets on their hands. And so that the wanting to give them material that was worthy of what they were capable of was really a challenge and exciting. And I got off on the first Muppet bit I wrote, I got off on a good foot. I wrote there was a format, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, in which Kermit was directing a film, right?
Yeah.
Right. It was a way to use Kermit from time to time. So Kermit was directing a production of Oklahoma. And
classic bit.
Classic.
Love that. With Forgetful Jones. Yeah.
I love that.
That's me. And that's
So
the
great.
first bit I wrote. And I don't know that
that's cool.
I don't know that I ever wrote a better one, but it was it was like a stroke of luck. Because again, I could go into the studio and
I love it.
I mean, there was Henson and Jerry Nelson and Richard and Richard and they were doing something that was a good bit. They were great at it, and I thought, okay, I would set the bar fairly high here. I'm not going to hit it every time, but it was a good way to start with them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah. Jim was. One of the things that was amazing about Jim, it's completely unlike me. I mean, I was never close to Jim. I would just see him in the studio. I know Frank Oz and Richard Hunt and Jerry a little bit, but Jim was always doing 6 things at the same time. But when he would come into the studio and he would put the puppet on, he would be 100% focused on what he was doing inside that event. And when he was done and he took the puppet off, then he would be right back into the other 5 things that were on his mind beforehand. His ability to focus and bring the best of what he had to offer into each of these individual moments was really something to watch. Hard to do.
Absolutely. Oh yeah.
Definitely.
Without a doubt. So speaking of characters, did you have any favorite characters to write for during your time at Sesame?
Yes, I have to say, and it became a problem as life and research wore on. My favorite character to write for was Telly, because
Marty.
Telly was saturated
Marty's
with
great.
anxiety, and writing for a character that's saturated with anxiety is a lot of fun. And it's a good fit with me, but it's also just in terms of writing the kind of stuff that you would write for that show. I thought it was a perfect fit, because you would start with somebody who had a little bit of a problem, and the problem would get worse, and he would make it worse as he thought about how to make it better. And there was a way things would spiral forward with him that I thought was great. And Marty Robinson, who was Telly,
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Marty's
A great friend of ours.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and Marty is just brilliant. I mean, Marty was brilliant. So I was writing for Telly,
Absolutely.
but I was also, secretly I was writing for Marty, who was, I mean, but all those guys, Kevin, all those guys were amazing. But Marty, it was just the connection between what I wanted to write about and what Marty was really good at, it seemed to me.
Yeah,
that's great.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense because like they're like I remember like other writers we got to chat previously, like, and I remember like I remember like one of their like favorite characters I got to wrote for Sesame is Telly, because you know how Telly can be so like, what are we about to do with
Neurotic,
this?
yeah.
And
Yeah,
this?
no, it's totally
Yeah.
neurotic. I always
Yeah.
had,
Totally.
I
You
wouldn't
just have so much fun doing things with
I
Telly,
found
you
it
know?
challenging to write for Big Bird, and I'm going to do it because it was part of the job, and it was fine. But the kind of the absence of irony made him sort of challenging for me. Whereas with Telly, I just needed to sit down and kind of crack my knuckles and go to work. And writing for Elder, but there were a lot of characters you could write for that were a lot of fun. Richard Hunt's character.
Like how like Richard is with Forgetful Jones. I mean, I know Matt Vogel's now taking over Forgetful Jones, and now with Big Bird and Count and all the characters he's done for the Muppets now. But like, I think there is a time like on that sketch where like Kermit was so like, you did
So
wrong.
frustrated.
Yes.
And more frustrated, and like, and it makes a lot of sense that his name is first part of the name was legit Forgetful.
Yeah,
He forgets everything.
and I mean, and Richard, both of them, but particularly Richard, improvised in an appropriate way around the script.
Yeah.
And he, I mean, it was perfect what he was doing. The way he got himself off stage, and then each time he would screw up. I mean, he was great. He was great. It was very hard to lose him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And now there's like a biography recently came out.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes, it is.
I should know this. I should read
it. There was a book that just came out recently
about Richard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which Max Stain got to wrote it. And what's it called? Is it called The Funny Boy or something?
Funny Man, I think.
Funny Man.
I'll find it. I'll find it. And I have to say, one of the things that was difficult, not in writing for the show, but given my tenure there, was that when I arrived, the whole first generation of kind of geniuses who invented it were still there. Frank was there, Jim was there, Jerry was there, Richard was there, and John Stone was there. And so I had a few years where I was working with the guys who basically had invented the show and were, the Babe Ruth and the Lou Gehrig of Muppets, because they'd invented Muppets. And then when Jim died, and as gradually there would be a turnover, and different, amazingly talented Muppeteers would step in and take over a character that had been left without anybody to perform them. When Jerry died, obviously, when Jim died, when Richard died, and it was, that was all. It was fine, and it was great to get, because the replacements were all terrific, but they just weren't the guys, and so it's like. I lived through that period, and I would never stop being a huge pleasure writing for the show. But I think one of the reasons why Telly remains so attractive to me was Marty was a continuing performing presence, and yeah, and I also had the very good fortune of Norman was a terrific head writer. I mean, there was a lot to be learned from Norman. And then, when Norman was gone, Lou Berger took over, and Lou was also great. Lou was great.
Lou Berger, yeah.
Lou was great to work with, and so Lou was there forever. And then when Lou left, Joey Mazzarino, who was a good friend of mine.
Oh, love Joey.
Oh, Joey.
Goodness.
So I had these three head writers all of whom each in his own way was a pleasure to collaborate with. And I never had the experience that I guess people can have where there's kind of a friction or some kind of a tension, or suddenly Lou wants something that's different from what Norman wanted, or Joey wants something that's different from what Lou wanted. None of that. There was a real continuum that was great.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
That's wonderful.
Jake, I apologize. You were correct. The biography is called Funny Boy. You
Funny
were right
Boy?
on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Funny Boy, the Richard Hunt biography.
Nice.
I mean, I also had
You're welcome.
staying with the same idea. I also
watchers and listeners.
I was lucky enough to get to Sesame Street when no one cared about the ratings because there was no competition. There were no other shows. So people could be just totally focused on what the mission of the show was. And then by the time I decided, I don't want to overstay my welcome here. I think it's time to wrap it up. The whole, starting with Nickelodeon, but the whole area of the arena of preschool television had become saturated with, a huge amount of competition, which meant that the show itself had to begin to make adjustments in terms of what its ambitions were and how it was going to deliver them. And
Yeah, because now it's a half hour long.
yeah, it's a half hour long, and it's not really, one of the skills, the great skills, and you either kind of had it or you didn't. In the beginning, was the ability to write on. It was people would say it out loud. The ability to write on two levels. That you had to write something that would not condescend to the kids at all. Everything had to be available to them, but it also had to be reaching adults in a different way, because if adults weren't going to watch, then they were going to turn to something else. And so, all those formats like Monster Piece Theater and, like the list goes on, I can't sum it up at the moment, but you were always trying to find ways to be witty in a way that kids would appreciate, not as wit, but as what they could take on board as preschool kids, whereas the parents could be hearing it on a different level. And when you could pull that off, then that was like sort of the perfect Sesame Street. The show lived in that space forever, so very successfully. It's not like you just hit it every now and then. You had to do it every time,
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So now this is kind of a well, not really like a difficult question to answer, but like
I'll be the judge of that, young man. If it's a math question, I'm not going to answer at all. So go ahead, give it a shot.
Well, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Second time something like this happened.
Yeah.
Anyway, so are there like any like Sesame Street episodes you wrote that stick out as some of your favorites?
Oh boy, this is gonna, well, it's a serious answer. It turns out every year now, because I watched it with my wife last night, 60 Minutes did a show on 9/11 in the fire department.
Yeah.
Really powerful. And after 9/11, I mean, nobody knew. That's an odd way to put it, but it's like everybody, my daughter was in college, but my son was in middle school on the east side of New York. And I came back to the apartment after going out to the supermarket, and somebody said, you got to turn on your television. And I lived through, as a parent, what that day was like, trying to retrieve my kid. Do I wait? Is he going to call here? Nobody had cell phones. They existed, but it was like, and so finally I went over, I found him, we came back, sat, watched, this sort of horror show. And afterwards, Sesame Street was trying to decide what, if anything, they could do for their audience, given this traumatic event that had occurred and that had affected everybody. If you were 3 years old, you didn't know what's everybody upset about. I mean, because
Right.
and I worked with, I can't remember, I guess it was Norman, maybe it was Lou, but they asked me to write the show, and that would address that issue. And what we hit on was, the show starts with Elmo and Maria are having breakfast in Hooper's store. There's a fire.
Yeah,
And
This is a firehouse.
Firehouse,
Yeah.
yeah. fills with smoke, and
Yeah.
fire
Yeah.
department comes, they
And then
put it
Elmo
out.
was like afraid about what
To
Yeah.
go back in.
Yeah.
Almost everything. And everybody thinks everything's cool, and then they look and realize Elmo is still traumatized. And so the firemen invite him to the firehouse to show him where they live, how they work, what
Yeah, I
they
love
do.
that
And
sketch.
so I wrote that, and I with Kevin and I get and Maria. Sonia was, I guess, was the non-puppet character of the piece. And this
Yeah.
was a firehouse that had lost four guys. I mean, every firehouse had, but and it was very powerful and very moving to be there. Shoot, the guys were great. I mean, but shooting this, I felt like the show had given me an opportunity um, to actually do something constructive in response to this nightmare event, as opposed to just being upset and undone by it. Like, actually had to sit down, do a piece of work aimed at a particular audience that wouldn't understand it, but that maybe was experiencing it in a very deep and powerful way and was upset by it. That's a show. So that's a show I've described them that I really remember. There must be a couple of ones that were less, shall we say, less serious. But I have to think about it. If I not, I did so many shows over such a long period of time that it's hard to. The ones I tend to remember, the ones that didn't work, because being in the studio with something was like, oh my God, this doesn't work. There was one show I wrote that was, whether Luis and Maria had a baby or baby was on the way. It was sort of about childproofing your apartment, which, I think Norman was the head writer. I didn't shove it down anybody's throat, but it had nothing to do with what a 3-year-old, no 3-year-old needs to learn about how to childproof an apartment, because they're not going to have children for a long time. And it seemed like, well, if they're talking about, putting handles on the whatever you need to put handles on so kids won't get in trouble, it would make a show, and it didn't work. It was talky, it wasn't fun, and I was in the studio, and the actors were not having a good time. Let me put it that way. And I've been in rehearsal rooms when the actors aren't having a good time. You don't want to, you don't want to be there, because it's your fault. And so I remember a couple of those, but actually over the course of all that time, there were only a couple of those where I thought, you know what, this didn't work out. I wrote one show fairly early on where it was based on a show that somebody else had written, where like the hell was the magician's name?
Mumford.
Mumford, yeah. Mumford had, as usual, had fucked something up, and it was like, he was working on a radio. She was repairing a radio, and Big Bird comes in, and the same thing goes wrong. But now it's like Big Bird's voice is coming out of the radio, and the radio is coming out of Maria, and whatever I'm not mentioning is coming out of Big. So it made for it was fun, and it worked. It might have been too complicated, but I don't think it was. I remember that one. But I don't have one of the things I always wanted, and you couldn't get it, was videotape of your shows at the end of the season. So I wish I had, like a set of DVDs of however many shows I wrote, so I could remind myself what I wrote. They gave us our sound copies of our scripts for a while, but that's really not of interest. What you want is the full. So I mean, every now and then I'll be curious about something and look it up on YouTube, but that's different,
Right. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. I mean, I know there was like a one that you got to like wrote that involved was like kind of like a tribute to Jerry.
Yes, that was also, and Joey, credit where credit is due. I mean, Joey Masri and I sat around, and it was really sort of the fundamental idea of the show was Jerry's, but it was the idea was that the Count had won the Nobel Prize for counting, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
so
and he like wasn't there at
he wasn't
first,
there.
Yeah.
and
He
then
was in Chicago, and his flight
exactly.
had been delayed. He was at O'Hare, and
Yeah.
he didn't care because he was like counting the number of flights that had been delayed, and he was having a ball. But the Swedes were gonna leave and give the award to somebody else, unless
Yeah.
which they eventually did, and then so the Count does make an appearance at the end, and Jerry had passed, Jerry was gone, but they were able to find enough language. There was a lot of it, obviously, to deliver the dialogue that I had written. And the point was that he didn't care that he had missed the Swedes and didn't get the award. I can't remember how I wrote it. As I said, Jerry was very involved. Joey was, but the idea was that it was much better to count people who missed you when you weren't there. And he started to count. Everybody had dressed up as the Count in order to try to fool the committee from the Nobel Prize committee into thinking one of them was the Count, and they'd give him the award or her the award, and then they'd pass it on to the Count. So you had everybody in the cast, including the puppets, dressed up as the Count and doing Count imitations, and then the Count himself came in at the end. That was that was one of those times where there was a lot of emotion in the room.
Yeah.
But it still was a complete Sesame Street show. You know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It wasn't like,
sure.
okay, we're dealing with something sorrowful now, so we're going to set the style and the attitude of the show aside and do something more. No, it was, if you were a kid watching at home, it didn't have anything to do with the fact that Jerry Nelson had died. It was just a Sesame Street show.
Yeah.
Jerry was he was a kind of a genius, and just so interesting, and so talented in so many different ways. Again, it was like, even after Jim died, there was this amazing group of artists who would come in and do the puppets. And I think this may or may not be true of other people, but before I went to work for the show, I kind of assumed that there was this group of puppeteers, and depending on what their schedules were, somebody would show up, and any one of three guys could be the Count, or any one of three guys could be Kermit. And it was explained to me, no. These Bert and Ernie are Jim and Frank. Nobody else does those characters. They are those characters, and Jerry is the Count. Nobody else does the Count. And so that relationship between the artists, with their arms in the puppets and the puppets, was something I had not understood till I got there. But it was a wonderful aspect of working there.
Absolutely. So you also got to write for a number of the recurring segments on the show, including some of the parody segments, including Monster Piece Theater and Cookie's Crummy Pictures, because those kind of were parody segments. What was writing those like?
Well, Cookie's Crummy Pictures was sort of towards the end of my tenure there, when the show was kind of trying to come up with new ideas that might be useful in terms of the other kinds of preschool shows that were then on the air. I think the Cookie's Crummy Picture show that I wrote that seemed successful to me was Jurassic Cookie. Are you guys familiar with this? I think that's that was the format for which I wrote that, which was it's funny. I mean, Cookie Monster was a good fit with the whoever the grandfather character was. Who's that actor? English actor. But I Monster Piece Theater was just counting as he walks up 39 steps, and that was the bit.
Oh yeah.
You came back to Cookie, and the best ones were always that simple. I can't remember any other ones. There were a bunch I wrote that I liked a lot. I'm not remembering them at the moment. There was one.
You mean Kathy Turo?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
she's great too.
Yeah.
She's great. No, she's through. It was a great group. It was just a great group of people.
Absolutely.
I wrote one bit that didn't. Like I said, you remember the ones that didn't work, and I always feel like it's like a director's problem, but maybe not. I wrote, I took as my text the Bergman film, The Seventh Seal.
Hmm.
And, there was one of Kevin Clash's characters was Wolfgang the Seal, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So,
Yes.
and it's like in a black and white scene. There's a character, a hooded character meant to represent death, but not to a 3-year-old. It's just a guy in a, and Wolfgang, I can't remember what motivated him, would pass, and the idea was, the question was that the seventh seal? No, that was the first seal. Okay, then Kevin would pass again. It was like, is that the seventh seal? No, it's the second seal. And even as I describe it, I wish somebody had said it's going to take a really long time to get to 7. And also Kevin, for some reason, instead of just turning around and crossing, doing an immediate cross, he would go around behind the set. So everything was really slow. And that was one of those days where I thought, oh, these geniuses are here, and I've given something that's not actually going to work. I wish I could remember some of the other ones. I will too late. I did write a piece for Monster Piece Theater that almost got shot but didn't. I wrote a piece called based on Some Like It Hot. And the Cookie introduced this jazz band, like in a movie. And the idea was that it was a some, more, and most, which was, or all, some, more, and all, whatever the 3 variations were. First time, it's like they all like it hot, and the Cookie has to interrupt, say, no, it's not. That's all. They all like it hot. And the second one was most like it. In any event, they were going to shoot before there was going to be a day in the studio. They would circulate the scripts, which had in them the bits that were going to be shot. And I had described in detail how the members of this band should be guys, like Muppets. That's the gag in the movie. And it's like the producers like hadn't noticed. So I went to Norman the day before. I said, Norman, are they really going to shoot this? This is wild. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, oh my God. So he called the costume shop or whatever. And that was the end of that bit. But it was, yeah. Still a funny idea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So speaking of characters, you also wrote for the Elmo segments, Elmo's World and Elmo the Musical. Elmo the Musical, of course, was kind of towards the end of your run. But what was working on those 2 like?
Well, they were fine. I have to say, and this is about me, not about the material, but you know, I felt as if because I'd been there for a long time when at Elmo's World, which was created by Judy Freudberg and Tony, it was inspired. I mean, just completely inspired. Everything about it, whether it was Mr. Noodle or the song at the end.
Yeah.
But I had kind of fallen into the groove of writing what had always been kind of the traditional, conventional Sesame Street material, Muppet bits on the street. Sometimes the beginning, when I first got there, the bits on the street were not narrative driven, and then they were. That was all fine. But when these kind of new formats were being developed, I was less interested in them than other people were. And it, again, has nothing to do with, oh, that's not a good idea. It was just, I wanted to mostly kind of keep doing what I'd been doing because I enjoyed it. And I wrote one about bananas that I don't think is shown that often, and maybe 1 or 2 others. But I never could kind of fall into the rhythm of how to make that stuff really work.
Yeah, especially like that you're just kind of like so used to with the old format that you're so used to, and then working on a new format, it was like huh,
Yeah, no,
I get that.
yeah, it was a little like, I mean, talk to the younger guys. I'm gonna go out and smoke a cigarette and have a cup of coffee. Then I'll come back and write what I'm doing. And as I said, the writer's room, which was never described as a writer's room on that show, was just a pleasure to be in. I mean, the collection of people who wrote the show were delightful. Some of us are still in touch with each other. A big shift was when the street went around the corner and there was
Oh yeah.
all these other people, all these other characters and all this other stuff. It's like, what are we doing here? The one thing that seemed like really sort of inspired and fun was the Muppet Motel, whatever the hell it was called.
Oh, the Furry Arms Hotel, yeah.
Furry Arms, that was. I remember I wrote some show that was set in the Furry Arms Hotel, but yeah, no, I mean, and again, as I say, this is not about everything was great, before the steam engine was invented. It's just that it was, I had a long run with the show when it was still basically what John and Jim and Frank and Norman, the creators created. And I loved being in that space, and was never really comfortable, particularly happy moving out of it.
Right. So now, aside from writing for, Muppets, you also wrote for various celebrity appearances on the show. Who were some of your favorite celebrities to write for?
The one I remember, I'm not sure I can remember any of the others, but I remember, again, Joey was the head writer, and he and I had sort of cooked this up. Wrote a bit for Robert De Niro.
Oh, nice.
Right.
And De Niro showed up, and it was almost like not like he didn't want to be there, but it was like, most celebrities would come in and think it was kind of cool. I wrote a whole show that Seth Green did, and he was great. The set for a major motion picture in which he was he was so prepared. And but De Niro showed up, and he was kind of, it's like, oh, it's Robert De Niro, and it's like, okay, what do I do? And it's like the bit was about imagination, and
where it's about where him and Elmo basically him imagines that he's Elmo or something.
And De Niro's performance is like, when it was being shot, it was like anybody home there, Bob? Can we get a little? It was like, oh, okay, Elmo. So you want me to pretend to be a dog? Okay.
Right.
That's how it is. Woof, woof, woof. Woof, woof, woof.
Exactly.
And in fact, when the bit was put together and Elmo was substituted for De Niro, it worked great. And De Niro's kind of deadpan presentation worked perfectly. But it was odd being there because you had no idea if this was gonna just be a train wreck or if it was gonna work out in the end. I'm trying to remember who else I wrote for. The Seth Green show I remember particularly because it was, like I said, celebrities in my experience would show up with different amount of preparation, and when somebody showed up who really had come to work, it was great because that really made the show work. I mean, David Hyde Pierce did a show that I wrote that was about cookies and Cookie Monster and Hooper's Store. I don't know what the hell it was about, but he was not on the show. It was as if he was, showing up for the first day of rehearsal for a major Broadway musical or a major Broadway play, and you always really appreciated that, and it made a huge difference.
And then there's also, well, it's not an episode or anything, but a song actually with our Rick Moranis. Stick out your hand and say hello, that one.
Yes, that was me and Chris Surf. I had known Chris
I love
since
Chris.
since I was in high school, and I love Chris. And
he's the best.
And Chris is fantastic. And so he and I found a way to write songs together. The only way to work together was, I would write lyrics with him, and I don't know, it was only 3 or 4 or 5 songs, and I have no aptitude for music at all, but he was a pleasure to work with. We wrote a song that was never produced, and we're both still grumpy about it. It was called The Triangle of Life. And
wow.
It was basically the Lion King, but instead of the circle of life, it was a triangle. And it was, I mean, Telly was, the king of the triangles. And so I can't remember exactly how it worked, but we thought we were geniuses. It's like, oh, come on, man. This is the biggest movie in the history of animation. And there's other, I'd have to find it. And I should call Chris and say, whatever happened to that?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
I did write not an Elmo's World, but what was the hell was the other extended long form Elmo?
Elmo the Musical?
Yes. I wrote an Elmo the Musical, which I think I might have written the lyrics because it was part of the job. It was about it was like an Olympic competition. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I
And
remember
I
that.
discovered afterwards, because he told me, that Jason Robert Brown had written the music. And I thought, holy shit, I can't believe it. Jason Robert Brown was compelled to set my lyrics to his music.
I know.
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
That's great. And another song that that you got to be involved with Chris on, which another song that I remember so fondly was Things Are Always Changing.
Yeah, that was a song that Hoots the Owl sings.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
And it's about like where like Jimmy or something, and the character that Jerry played. Yeah. Where he's like kind of like nervous to go to like his about the move next day. So Hoots kind of just was there with him, and then like and then Hoots just say things are always changing.
Yeah. Guys, I'm glad you remember this stuff. I can find it if I try. Surf and I wrote another song that was never produced. We were also sore about. It was like we wrote a song that was, kind of it was about open and close. The open and close was the curriculum goal, but it was like it was a group of puppets called the Doors, right?
Oh, interesting.
The doors were either open or closed, but the music, which Chris wrote, was like the Doors at their most kind of drugged out, depressed.
Yeah.
Drugged out, depressed mode. And it was like, guys, we're not going to do that. It's like, no, come on, do it. It's funny. The doors are either open or they're closed. It was a simple idea, but I don't know. Write the show and tell them they should produce it. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, but I don't, it's like, it's interesting when you guys are asking me about this stuff. I do not have a lot of what I wrote for the show was written on the very first computer I ever had, which crashed. And so the stuff is just gone.
Yeah, right. There's really only YouTube to look at now, really.
Potentially.
Yeah, and I can't believe, and I would need to know what to look for. It's like,
right, yeah.
Hoots the Owl singing the song. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that, but I wouldn't.
Yeah,
I would not have remembered it independently.
Right.
A list someplace. Oh, too late.
Right.
But yeah, such a great song too.
Yes.
So great. So now, well, technically moving on from Sesame Street, I guess, you got to, it was kind of another series you got to be involved, was another, production, the Upside Down Show.
Oh yeah, which I don't, which, I mean, I might have written one script for them. I don't remember.
Yeah,
I mean,
that was the mini golf one.
You know what, I remember, it was Belinda Ward, who was great.
I love
Belinda. Belinda's fantastic. And I remember going to like some meetings, and it's like these Australian guys, they're really funny. And it's like,
Dave and Shane. Yeah.
I
had that puppet
that
Matt McCoy got to do.
Yeah. If you'd asked me, I would have said, well, I went to the meetings and I decided I was not going to write for the show. I'm not surprised that I wrote one script. I don't remember. I remember those guys being really funny. But again, all these things which were in an adjacent lane to the basic show were places that, so I would occasionally sort of step into or be invited to step into, but it wasn't really, my heart was never really in it,
Right.
Yeah.
All right, and also quickly going back to Sesame Street, I just remembered because before this we were watching a little bit of it, something that you and Joey got to co-write, which was the Sesame Street 4D movie magic. It was for like for Universal.
Oh, you know what? I'm not sure I've ever seen that. Does the world need to hear this? I don't know. When my kids were little, I said, okay, I'm your dad, and we can everything's negotiable, but we're not getting a dog because we live in Manhattan, and I'm not going to walk the dog at 11 o'clock at night. So we can talk about it, but I'm telling you now, the answer is going to be no. And the other thing is, we're not going to Orlando, okay? Because I hate lines. So we're not going to Orlando. So everything else is negotiable. We'll do workarounds. We'll see what happens. And then Joey and I got asked to write the script for this thing at Universal, and I don't know I don't know who the ask came from, and I said, yeah, let me talk to Joey. I said, and let me call you back. So I said, I think I would like to do it, but I said I feel like in order to do it well, I feel like I need to be able to see what I'm looking at through kids' eyes, So I would have to be able to take my two children with me when we go down to, Disney World and to Universal to do the research. I can understand if that would be a problem, but let me know if that's not possible. I think I'll pass. So that I got a call 5 minutes later from somebody who was appropriately annoyed, saying, "Yeah, okay, that'll work." So Joey and his wife, Carrie Butler, who's great, and me and my kids went down and had a great, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, always being taken to the head of every line of everything we wanted to look at. And I had a ball. I mean, I thought Disney World was great. And so was, Universal. But yeah, where would I go to see that, gents? I've never
There's a
seen.
there's a clip of it on YouTube because it was in Japan. It was
Yes,
it
it
was
was
used
great.
it was
Is
used
it
in
still
Japan
there?
first, and then I think it made its way to some of the U.S. attractions later
That
on.
sounds right. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, it was going to be done in Japanese. I think, as I recall, Cookie Monster becomes enormous like Godzilla, and I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
But the fun part, that's something where the fun part was writing with Joey, traveling with Joey, creating with Joey. Joey's great.
He is. I'll have to tell him. I'll tell him if you want that you say hello because he's also a good friend and he's a previous guest of the podcast too.
Mm-hmm.
He and I are in touch from time to time. I haven't seen him in a while, but yeah. Tell him I said hi.
Absolutely.
What do?
Absolutely. So, one of your most recent projects, moving away from Sesame and all that, was revising the book for the musical "I Can Get It For You Wholesale," which was
Yes,
originally written by your father. What
correct.
went into working on that?
Well, I got a call from a producer named Jeffrey Richards, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, before the pandemic. And Jeffrey was interested in the musical, I Can Get It For You Wholesale. The musical, which my dad wrote the book for in 1962, was based on his first novel, which had been published in 1937. And the novel was a really raw, rough portrait of a really bad guy in the garment district, behaving badly and basically getting away with it. And when they did the musical in 62, they kind of sawed the edges off and they gave it a kind of a redemptive, happy ending. And it was okay. It was fine. It was good. And it ran for 8 or 9 months, I think. But so Jeffrey was calling me up and I said, if you're interested in the rights to the musical, my brother and I controlled the rights to the book part of it. I said, I'm happy to have, nobody ever does the show. I said, they're all yours. He said, well, no, he said, I'd be interested in whether or not you think you could reach back to your dad's novel and pull some of the tone and the attitude of the novel into the musical and make it a much really rougher, complicated piece. And I said, well, I don't know. I haven't read the novel in a long time. I read the novel and I said, that's an interesting idea. So let me see what I can do. And I got paired very early on by Jeffrey with a director named Trip Cullman, who we became sort of partners in reimagining how this process would work. And most of what I did was to reach into the novel but I mean the show that we did at Classic Stage, the last 20 minutes are completely different from what the show was on Broadway. And there's no redemptive ending. Harry Bogan behaves really badly. People suffer for it, and that's what Harry does. But that material came from my dad's novel. So, and part of the process was adapting his work, using a lot of his language to reshape the end of the show. But that process, we engaged in that process throughout. And, I wrote in working with Tripp, a prologue for the piece and an epilogue and new material throughout that seemed to me like something that my dad would have approved of, and might have done in '62 if he thought a Broadway audience was ready for it, even though what we did downtown belonged off Broadway. I mean, a Broadway audience this was not a reimagined piece that was going to run for 3 years at the Broadhurst Theater, but it was hugely satisfying. It was one of those things that I think everybody involved with it felt like that we'd accomplished exactly what we set out to accomplish. And, so it had its limited run, and third season off Broadway, it was, oh, look, people really paid attention, and it won the Outer Critics Circle Award for Best Musical Revival, a couple of others where it was in competition with Broadway musicals. And the score, which was reshaped and reimagined, has been recorded. So there'll be a cast album that'll come out in the fall. And so there'll be this new version of the show and a new album to go with it. And, hopefully it'll start to be performed around the country. But it was interesting to I won't say rewrite. I wasn't fixing my dad's show. I was trying to respond to the idea of what it might have been like if he'd been doing the adaptation now, given what's acceptable on Broadway now as opposed to
back then, yeah,
60 years ago.
Right. So as we're getting close to wrapping up, can you share any projects that you're currently working on?
Well, I've been working with Roseanne Cash on an adaptation of a musical adaptation of the movie Norma Ray. I don't know if you know it, 1978. Sally Field won an Oscar for it. It's a great film. You should take a look at it sometime. I mean, really, it's a great movie. It's about a union effort in a cotton mill in North Carolina, but really about Sally Field playing a worker in the mill and the way that she evolves throughout the course of the story. A labor organizer arrives from Brooklyn and things happen. So we're waiting to see if we're going to get a production of that. We sort of looked like we were going to, and then the pandemic put everything on hold, and we're waiting to hear from a director who's reading it now. That's the kind of main thing on my desk at the moment. I started to work on another project that was an author's piece, but it's a massive undertaking, and I'm not quite sure I'm up to it. The musicals take so long now, guys. It's like you just, it didn't. My dad only worked in the theater for like 6 or 7 years. He was a novelist, worked in the theater for a while, then he just went back and wrote novels again. But he did a show in 1960 and then another show in 1960. I mean, these shows opened on Broadway. 60, 62, 64, kind of 67, and then he was kind of done. But you could get from conception to production, you could move with that kind of speed. And now it's like a 7 or 8 year process.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So-
Looking forward for more what's coming up in the future.
Yeah, so to wrap this up, this question that Jake's about to ask is a question we ask all of our guests at the end. Go ahead, Jake.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Of course, this podcast is called Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show. When you think of nostalgia, what do you think of? In other words, how would you define the word nostalgia?
I guess to me, nostalgia has a slightly pejorative quality. It's like a tone to the word. I never thought about this before. And don't take this the wrong way. But I feel like it implies looking back. It's not fair to the word, because what you're getting is my processing, the way I think about looking back. It's like looking back with some sense that there was kind of a golden age when everything was great. Now things aren't as good as they used to be. I totally committed to the idea. I mean, everything we've talked about is, is the baggage which I carry moving forward when I sit down to write something new. Or I mean, it's all of it has flowed into who I am and what I've created. And I'm very pleased with the work that I've done and the way it now lives in the world. I don't think when in this conversation, I haven't felt like I was taking a kind of a nostalgic journey back through the early parts of my life, because
Right.
remembering them has a kind of vitality in the moment that's quite exciting and sort of stimulating to reimagine and to relive. I hadn't thought about how the seventh seal didn't work for a very long time, but so I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question, but it's like I feel like memory plus present energy is a great combination. Memory without present energy I think is sometimes what people think of when they use the word nostalgia, like kind of old time movies,
Right.
Right? As opposed to early movies that then led to other movies that now lead to what we're looking at now. Have I
Gotcha.
did I even come close to answering your question?
Yeah, I'd say so, yeah.
Did I sound pompous enough? Was that pompous enough? I can,
Yes.
it
Yes,
was,
no
okay,
worries at
good.
all.
Because I can be more pompous if you want. But
You're good,
that's
you're
good.
good.
That works for you.
Good
I'll
as all.
stop there. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Glad we were able to make it happen.
Thanks a
Take
lot.
care.
Thank you.
You too.
You as well.
Guys,
Bye-bye.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. It's goodbye from us as well. We absolutely enjoyed our time speaking with the wonderful John Weidman. Keep on the lookout for more wonderful interviews coming your way. And as always, what do we say, Jake?
Keep nostalgia alive. Take care, everyone. See you next time. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another wonderful Jake's Happy Nostalgia Show episode. Be sure to follow Jake and the Happy Nostalgia team on social media, check out our website, and stream the show wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And as always, remember to keep nostalgia alive. Bye-bye.